Yo YouTube! So today we're going to talk about how to paint darker skin tones. Now this video is going to be a companion to the previous video I did where I talk about how you can go about creating a portrait with gouache. So I'm going to use a lot of the same materials. The brushes and Stay Wet palette will all be the same, but since I just received some Turner supplies, I'm actually going to use the Turner Acryl gouache, which has a lot of the same characteristics as the Holbein acrylic gouache that I used in the last video. So this video will be a little bit of a product comparison as well. Now when I'm painting darker skin tones, I like to start with burnt sienna and darken up that color by incorporating some violet. Violet is a great way to neutralize the orange tones in the burnt sienna, and it still has a little bit of warmth to it because violet's made out of blue and red. You can start with a burnt umber if you want, but I like to start with a burnt sienna, that way I can get some more hue variation as I add in that violet and the blue in order to create my darkest value. I find this to be a little bit more realistic when rendering darker skin tones, and there's a couple fundamental reasons for that, and they primarily have to deal with light physics. So higher melanin levels and darker skin tones keep light from entering the body. It's an evolutionary response to avoid solar radiation, which can cause cell death. And as artists, we care about this phenomenon because it affects the colors that we're trying to represent. So darker skin tones will have less of a phenomenon called transdermal scattering, which is when the light enters the skin and kind of illuminates it. If you put your hand up to a strong light and you can see how the webbing kind of glows, that's a really good example of transdermal scattering. African skin tones and darker skin tones in general do such a good job bouncing that light off of the skin that you don't get as much transdermal scattering. You will, however, get a lot more bounce light and a lot more reflective light on darker skin tones, which can be really beautiful and really fun to paint as an artist. So now that I've got my darkest areas in this portrait established, I can start to move to my slightly lighter variations, and I'll do that by combining my main color with a little bit more of that burnt sienna. And I'm going to use this as a transition point for my darkest darks, because my goal right now is to build in some hue variation in the skin. Skin is really variable, there's not a whole lot of consistent areas of color, so you'll find that by building in this hue variation, you can give your portrait a lot more form and a more three-dimensional quality. For my lightest values, I'm mixing some of that burnt sienna with some permanent scarlet. The permanent scarlet in this set has a lot of orange to it, which is going to offer a lot of warmth to the skin tone. And I'd really suggest avoiding adding white at any stage outside of the highlights when rendering darker skin tones, as white will remove saturation from color, and darker skin tones have a lot of saturation. Particularly in the shadow areas on the skin tone, you'll get a higher saturation, and it'll have this really nice reddish hue, which I'm creating with the permanent scarlet and that base skin tone. Now I am going to use a little bit of white for the whites of the eye. This is particularly tricky on darker skin tones because if it's too light of a white, it just doesn't look realistic. The first pass I did of the whites of the eyes I feel like were a little bit too bright, so I actually went in and darkened them up, and it's more of a taupe color. It just looks white because of the interactions of the surrounding colors. Now, one of the phenomenon that we talked about earlier was reflect light. So reflective light is light from the environment that bounces off the surface. So because my background is this really bright, strong red, I'm going to have a lot of reflect light of that red in the skin tone of my portrait. And I'm going to create this effect by using a more diluted transparent wash of my base skin color and allowing some of that red background to shine through. Now, if you haven't painted with gouache before or you're not the most familiar with this medium, gouache has a tendency to dry a different color than what's put down. And the Turner Acryl gouache is no exception. I actually found that this gouache has a pretty high value shift when it comes to what it looks like wet versus what it looks like dry. Your darks will dry a lot lighter, and your light colors will dry a lot darker. So I did find myself going back and correcting some values in this piece later on, but that's just kind of how it goes when you're working with different paints from different brands. As I started to mix my values for the hair itself, I did end up actually incorporating just a little bit of black. Otherwise, I wouldn't have the differentiation between the hair and the skin tone that I wanted. And I'm taking a similar approach to hair as I always do, starting with my darkest areas, and then layering lighter values on top to imply a bit of form and dimension. By comparing the paint on my palette to the dried paint on my surface, you can really start to see that hue shift that I'm talking about with gouache. Even though that color looks almost pure black on my palette, it comes out as more of a dark purple when applied to my surface and allowed to dry. So we've talked about reflective light, which is when light hits a surface and then bounces onto the skin, casting that color. But there's also just bounce light from the light directly interacting with the skin tone itself. Bounce light on darker skin tones typically reads a little bit more blue, and this is going to be in contrast to the shadow areas on darker skin tone that are going to be more saturated and read a little bit more red or a little bit more warm. So to work on my bounce light, I'm going to cover up that red portion of the forehead because I don't want any red light to come through that area. I want it to be a very cool highlight. On really dark skin tones, you can almost get a blue halo to your highlights, which looks really beautiful. Now because the Turner gouache is a little bit more liquid than I'm used to, my palette's kind of run a mess and I'm starting to get into some muddy areas. So in order to make sure that my highlights and final colors are really nice and crisp, I'm going to start with a new palette and work on some finishing details. Now, unlike my previous video where I focused on a lighter skin tone, our color zones of the face are going to be a lot more subtle. Areas of thin skin, like the lips and the eyelids, will still read a bit warmer, but it will be a lot more subtle, especially since we have all that saturation in our shadow shapes. For the sake of contrast, I'm going to go with a nude lip on this portrait, since my background is that really strong red. And I'm also going to take a darker, almost blue-purple color, and add in a few of the darkest shadow areas. I'll also use it to correct the edges and to darken up the eyebrows, as now I can really see what those values are with the paint fully dry. One of my favorite phenomenon when rendering darker skin tones is specular highlights. And these are going to be the type of really shiny teardrop highlights that you see on like chrome objects. Darker skin tones have a higher instance of specular highlights because the skin is just so much better at bouncing out that light. And it doesn't diffuse through the skin like it would in a lighter skin tone. You can also think of lip gloss. It's a great example of those kind of specular highlights, and they're just so satisfying to paint in. As a final step, I'll go in and paint in her tank top straps, using this really vibrant green just because I love the color interaction of the background. And I'll also go in and add a bit more texture to her hair. I'm not really trying to render it realistically, I'm just trying to do the texture and the tight curl pattern justice. And I'm also going to go in and clean up her forehead and around some of those highlights a bit, just because I didn't like how flat it was looking. That highlight really needs to pop to imply the three-dimensional form. So I hope you found this video interesting and hopefully got a little bit more confidence in rendering darker skin tones in your own work. If you did find this beneficial, throw me a like so I can know, and feel free to subscribe.